Thank you. Okay, so good afternoon, everybody. Just had this very nice lunch with the churros at the end, so I'm up for a challenge to keep you awake, I guess. But, let's see. So you heard my bio. Here in this slide, you actually see also some of my hobbies, and I guess all the other stuff has already been mentioned. So the nice thing about, learning and publishing about architecture practices is that people ask you to help them improve their architecture practices. But all the time you spend doing that, which is very nice, you get to know a lot of organizations and meet a lot of great architects and teams. All that time you cannot spend being an architect anymore. So that is currently one of my challenges, is to keep also active as an architect. So, this has been a hot topic at this conference in the past, and how to combine architecture with agile working. And this slide just summarizes some of the misunderstandings and prejudices that there have been on the two sides of that equation. I started this morning by asking, who has ever been accused of slowing things down? And I saw a lot of people nodding their heads. And that is one of the prejudices against doing architecture, is that the business value will be delivered slower. On the other hand, there's also a lot of prejudices of architects, or maybe bad experiences that architects have had with people practicing agile practices a little bit too fanatically, such as reinventing the wheel, accumulation of technical debt, and short-lived solutions. So what we are trying to achieve with our practices, and we are helping more and more organizations to achieve this balance between agile working and using architecture. And actually you can get very nice results and get the best of both worlds if you find this balance. You can still do upfront design, but you use a shorter learning cycle to actually make the upfront design not big, but as small as is responsible. And that's actually what this talk is about. But of course, there's much more to this balance between agile and architecture. And if you want both, quick business value, that is one of the goals of agile working, but also risk and cost control, which is the main goal of architecture, then your challenge is to find that balance in your context. Because of course, there is not one answer. If you want to find the right sweet spot of combining agile and architecture practices, you have to first look at the context of your organization, and because that will determine where that sweet spot is. So today we'll be talking about architecture feedback loops. And what do I mean with that? Well, I copied this picture from a training that I once had a long time ago by the SCI, which was I guess a previous version of training that has been given here on Monday, which is the essential architecture training based on the SCI's practices. And one of the first things they tell you is that architecture has a business cycle. And this is an old picture that represents that business cycle. You see the architect here in the center, of course. And you basically see two arrows. On the left hand, you see all the drivers for your architecture, the business drivers, the commercial drivers, but also quality attributes and stuff like that. And on the right hand side, you see the architecture, which is produced by the architect. Now you can already tell that this is from the pre-agile age because of the way the architect is dressed, I guess, is one of them. But also the fact that there is, an architect as a person. What we see, of course, more and more is that architecture is more and more crowdsourced, and that it's not so much a person as a function of a team or something that is done by a number of people. However, this process still is still important. And you see that the feedback loop towards the stakeholders, which is the invisible party on this side of the business cycle, the stakeholders, happens in two ways, this feedback loop. First of all, based on the architecture, which is maybe a document or something else, but also based on the system that is created based on this architecture. So those are the two feedback loops that the architect is a part of. And if these feedback loops, they can be either long or they can be short. And I guess the whole assumption that this whole talk is based on is that probably shorter feedback loops are better. I've created a different version of this picture just to clarify this a little bit. You see the two feedback loops. One is from the architecture to the stakeholders. And this happens mostly through communication between architect and stakeholders, and through analysis of what the stakeholders need. What you see that this feedback loop is needed for understanding of the design. The stakeholders need some level of understanding of the design in order to better formulate their needs. And of course, they probably need the help of technical people like architects to do that. And then the other way around, the better understanding of the context leads to a better fit design, a design that better fits that context. So that is the first feedback loop towards the stakeholders. And the other feedback loop is towards the working systems. And this feedback loop works through, also through analysis, but also through building these systems, or maybe parts of them, prototypes, experimenting with them, and understanding of that architecture in operation then leads to a more feasible design, because that teaches you what works and what doesn't. And of course, a better design leads to better systems. So in the end, the whole goal of this is, of course, to design better systems. And so both of these feedback loops, it's in our interest to make them as short as possible, in the sense that you want to learn as quickly as possible. This understanding needs to be speeded up, both in this direction and in that direction, but also this understanding needs to be speeded up. So in order to understand a little bit better why the short feedback loops are better, I am repeating a slide that I already showed last year. I don't know who was here last year. Not here, but okay. That's about 40%, that's not bad. But for the other 60%, architecture is related to something quite old, which is the cone of uncertainty. This is an idea from Steve McConnell and Barry Beam. I guess one of them invented it and the others gave it its name. And the cone of uncertainty represents the passing of time when you are architecting, designing, building a system, or when you are executing a project, actually, that's what it was about. And nowadays you can also apply it to, for example, an epic. If you have an architecture epic, you start with not understanding very much about it, and there's a lot of uncertainty both ways. You know, it can be much harder than you originally thought, or it can be much easier than you originally thought. And this uncertainty, as time passes, this uncertainty will reduce by two mechanisms. The first mechanism is that as an architect you do research. You look at aspects of that epic or that project or that system, and by getting more understanding of that system, you will reduce the amount of uncertainty. And the second is by making actually architectural decisions, which is the result of that research, which enable you to make the right decisions. So basically, what I'm saying here is that architecture, one of the primary goals of architecture is to narrow this cone. And of course, if the cone gets narrower quicker, then that means that you are reducing uncertainty more efficiently, or at least more quicker. And so that is what we're trying to achieve. Now, if we're looking at the feedback loops, they increase the understanding and the speed of understanding. So if we are having long feedback loops, Then, of course, after the feedback loop, you probably have more extra information and more extra insight. So you reduce the amount of uncertainty. But maybe, and if you have short feedback loops, you also reduce the amount of uncertainty. And maybe with a lesser amount, but because you are so much quicker, in the end, the idea is that this will result in a faster learning process and a faster reducing of the uncertainty. So how do we shorten this feedback loop? And what we have done is we have looked at this problem and we came up with basically 5 tips for doing this. And I will spend the next 20 minutes or so going through these 5 tips with you. And the first tip is about how to look at architecture as a set of decisions instead of as a document, and I'll explain later. The second is about continuously sharing concerns and decisions with your stakeholders. And the third one is also about the feedback loop to the stakeholders by inviting immediate feedback. The fourth one is about using architecture documentation templates. Who here uses a template to document their architectures? Okay, that's about half of you. And so for the rest, this may not be as relevant, but maybe you will at the end also start using templates, I don't know. And the fifth one is to get involved in delivery, which is very much about the right-hand feedback loop towards the working systems. So, what happened there? Okay. The first tip, to look at architecture as a decision-making discipline rather than as a documenting discipline. And this means that your primary deliverable as an architect is no longer a document, which is how very many architects, especially those trained in the 90s or in the noughties, look at it. Because it takes too long to produce. And there's a second disadvantage to having an architecture document as the big thing that you are making. It is that an architecture document sort of tends to summarize all of the decisions that you have been taking up till that time. And then it sort of forces a synchronization of making those decisions final at the moment that this document is approved. And this sort of captures you in a trap where you have to synchronize all these decision processes artificially because you want to have this document approved. And that is actually something that is not very good for speeding up your feedback loop. And it's also not very good for optimizing the timing of your decisions. So instead, the architectural decision is your primary deliverable. It is an artifact with a much finer granularity, which already tells you that it should be easier and quicker to get feedback on it. And it allows individual timing of the decisions. This is very important. I think in our keynote yesterday, it was already said that you should delay decisions to the last responsible moment. Now, when that is it's not easy to calculate. It is probably some kind of a balance between cost of delaying the decision and the risk of making the wrong decision. But at least, it should be clear that every decision has its own optimum or most responsible moment of taking it. And by cutting up your architecture into these decisions, you can actually be more flexible in when you time them. And then you should continuously share your concerns and decisions. And this means that you actually have to be open to criticism. And especially for starting architects, this can be very, very scary. If you are a little bit unsure, and to invite feedback when you yourself are not sure that your decision is already a good one, can be very, very scary. So that is something that you need to consider. But of course, the sooner you share your decision with stakeholders, and these can be stakeholders on the business side, and it can be stakeholders on the delivery side, like development team or operations team or the security people. The sooner you share them and the sooner you are able to get feedback from them, the faster you learn. So my tip is always to share your decision as soon as you are aware even that the decision needs to be taken. Put it on some list, put it on your Jira, if you have stakeholders who actually use Jira, and make sure that the decision status is clear. This is something that we are still debating. But the sooner you put it out there, the better your chances are to get quick feedback. And then you should, of course, make access as easy as possible for these stakeholders, because otherwise, it's no use to share it. You're not really sharing, you're just putting it up there. So if your key stakeholders are business stakeholders, then probably you don't want to put it in Jira because your business stakeholders will never ever open that tool. But then maybe you should find some other content management system that is more accessible to them, like a wiki or something like that. Last year or 2 years, it was last year, Michael Keeling gave a talk about architectural decision records, and his tip actually, if your main stakeholders are developers, was to just put your decision records in the source code control system as flat files. So, if that's the most accessible to your primary stakeholders, then by all means do that. And then invite the immediate feedback. And so the problem here, of course, is that architects are perfectionists. At least most architects I know are perfectionists. They want to be the best at their job and they want to deliver the perfect design, right? And that is kind of counterintuitive then for them to release, preliminary versions, documents, or designs that are not yet internally consistent, Because if they can already point out what's wrong with this design, then imagine that the stakeholders can also easily point out what's wrong with it, and then you look bad, right? And that's one of the main obstructions or obstacles for people to share architectures before they are perfect. But you can't afford to wait that long. Because it can take, and this is from actual experience, it can take months to get your architecture into a state, or design into a state where you're saying, okay, at least now I know that it's internally consistent and I'm now thinking it's good enough to, as a version 0.9 to send to stakeholders to review. That really creates a very long feedback loop. So make it easy for people to actually give you feedback. I heard one person say, this is, of course, if your team is co-located in one room, you probably have your designs as big pieces of paper on the wall. And I've once heard, I don't remember who told me, but this is a great tip. Put a pen on a piece of string next to your architecture wallpaper, and so that people are actually stimulated to correct mistakes in it or to write stuff on it. Maybe nasty stuff, but the nastier the stuff, the better you learn from it. And of course, if you have, for example, a wiki to, as the example shows here, to share your architectural decisions, then make sure that everybody knows there's a comment box there where you can and invite people actively to put some words in there. So, for those of you who are using templates, the best tip here is to try to make that template as simple as possible. And because one of the things that really causes long feedback loops is something I call template bloat. And template bloat, templates tend to grow, right? Organizations that have an architecture document template, it starts out quite nicely. Maybe they download something from the SCI side or from Simon Brown's site. He has a very nice C4 architecture template. But it starts like nice and small, but then people start to realize, oh, but it's not complete. There is stuff that we ran into the last project that is not in the template. So they add a section for that. And then the next project, they run into something else, and they're saying, oh, maybe we should put that in the template as well. And before you know it, this template becomes the architecture knowledge repository of your organization, and it's like 50 or 60 pages. Then, of course, that's bad, because people will then tend to want to fill out all of these pages, and again, take a lot of time. And it doesn't help to actually mark some of these sections as not applicable yet, because people are then going to want to have discussions about why this should not be applicable yet, or I am not going to approve this because this section has not been filled out, so I'm not sure what I'm going to get, etc., etc. So template bloat is really bad. So you should simplify these templates by having only the sections for the most common concerns, and only at the very start of your life cycle, or the life cycle of your solution or your epic or whatever the template is for. Get rid of all these placeholder sections, the things that might be needed in some context or other. And then only add the views for the other concerns as they become significant later in a life cycle. So the template that we are using in CGI is quite simple. It has only 2 views in it, and both views are directed towards 2 architectural concerns or stakeholder concerns that are always there at around the same time at the beginning of the solution life cycle, which are what exactly is needed here, so the context of your solution, and how are we going to be able to create this? Is this a feasible solution? Those are the 2 concerns. Those are the only ones that you basically need at the beginning to get approval for some decision to justify or decision to fund some epic or whatever. And the rest, we have cut out of it. So, of course, what then happens is your architectural template, document template is very simple and minimal. Then it is no longer the knowledge repository for all of the architectural knowledge in your organization. So you actually need to have a different place to exchange that kind of knowledge. And so this got us thinking about, why are we documenting architecture? Because big architecture documents are bad for short feedback loops. So why are we doing it? And then we basically realized there's 3 use cases for architecture documentation. One is the evidence to the stakeholders that their concerns are being addressed. This is the main reason that we have architecture views, to show stakeholders that their concerns are being addressed. The second is to store architecture knowledge for later. So, we have figured something out, we have some concern that's still open, or we have something that the people that will run the solution later on will need to know. Or maybe that's something that I'm just writing down so that I don't forget about it. And the third use case is to collaborate and to communicate architectural decisions. Those are 3 quite different goals, and if you try to combine those goals into one big architecture document, then you get these big documents. Each of these has its own rhythm and language. And the big documents, of course, if you try to speak the various languages, people won't understand. It will take longer for them to give feedback, etc., etc. So this is why, and I call this goal-driven architecture documentation. If you realize that actually there are 3 use cases for documenting architectures, then it's a logical next step to actually separate the repositories for this documentation. Architecture views, of course, this is the traditional one. This is what the SEI book about documenting your architectures is about. And it's to communicate to stakeholders. Then we have the architecture knowledge repository, which is for storing stuff that you don't want your organization to forget, things like standards, etc. And here you can have things like wikis and modeling tools, etc. And then there's the architectural decision register, which could be a Jira or a wiki, where you have that drives your feedback loop with your stakeholders. And this, of course, is your primary deliverable, and the other ones sort of are elsewhere in the process. Here you see a kind of a model of how that would work. You would have your architecture microcycle here, where you are making your architectural decisions, leading to an architectural decision register and to an architecture knowledge repository. Both of these, of course, grow while you're gathering, while you're building your architecture. And from time to time, you will need to communicate some aspects to your stakeholders, and this will be in architecture views. And this is how you separate the three types of architecture knowledge and the way that you document or communicate them. And the final tip, get involved in delivery. And if you are a software architect, and since this, I guess, is primarily a software architecture conference, then the best way to get involved in delivery is to code yourself, of course. But there are architects that would really love to do that, like myself, but are not allowed to anymore. So, but that doesn't mean that we cannot get involved in delivery. You can get involved in integration, quality attribute testing, etc. There's various effective ways to do that. The only thing you should absolutely not do is, as soon as your design is finished and you've handed it over to the team for realization, to move on to the next project. Because that way you are not involved in delivery, you will not learn from your own mistakes. And that's basically a non-existent feedback loop that you have then. All right. So what we did was we asked our architecture community, we asked them in a survey a number of questions about these feedback loops. And I have some results of 2 of those questions here. We had 38 respondents to this survey. And one of the things we asked them is, how do you normally involve stakeholders in your architectural decisions? So this is about the left-hand loop, feedback loop that we were talking about in the beginning. And of course, the ones that are still mostly used, discuss at meetings, obviously. Let them review the architecture documentation. So that's still a little bit, let's say, the traditional way of having a feedback loop. But we are also seeing a significant amount of other ways. I was surprised about half of the architects, or about a third of them, actually shared the decisions in Jira. So that's apparently is becoming common practice. So that's good to know. By the way, you see orange and red here. The orange bars are the feedback loop with the delivery stakeholders, like the dev and the ops and the project team. And the red ones are the business stakeholders. And of course, the Jira, as we might expect, sharing decisions in a Jira is much more popular to communicate with delivery stakeholders than with business stakeholders. Just using a file or a shared drive is also used quite a lot. And then you see PowerPoint presentations, which is always laughed at a little bit. But I mean, it still is quite an effective way of communicating and getting feedback from many business stakeholders. The second question that I have some graphs for is which techniques for asking for decision feedback have you found to be effective to speed up that feedback loop? And interesting, maybe not surprising, is that just mail them or call them is actually on the top of the list here. Well, that's maybe a little bit of an open door, right? Setting deadlines apparently also helps quite a lot of architects. About half of them, I guess. And then asking for comments. And once again, I'm surprised that about a third of the architects find that an effective way of speeding up their feedback loop, because that shows to me a level of maturity in terms of thinking of decisions as your primary deliverable. And meetings, workshops, etc., especially for business stakeholders. I thought this was a funny one, money. So I mailed this guy, this was just one respondent, and I said, okay, what do you mean when you say money is an effective technique for speeding up your feedback loop? Are you bribing them? And he said, no. And what I mean is that I get feedback much quicker if I focus on economic aspects of the decisions and instead of just the technical aspects. And I think that, of course, makes a lot of sense. And here are some free text remarks that we got from the architects. Let's see, shall we pick some out of this? Politics. It's not about technology and requirements, cost versus risk. It's about power in the organization. That's a bit cynical, isn't it? But maybe this architect had a bad day when I sent him this survey. First discuss and then write down is more accepted, educational, and more fun. And then there's a very long one. By only putting minimal information story in the issue tracking system and instead referring to items in the modeling repository, I force development stakeholders to look at the model, which is much more complete. Eventually, it becomes normal for developers to look at the model before coding. That's interesting, right? That's also a piece of education that you are including in your feedback loop. And then finally, spoon-feeding the higher level architects with decisions and a growing number of pictures during, say, 8 to 10 weeks is preferred as opposed to writing a document in 4 weeks and then getting it reviewed. And I think that sort of summarizes the whole point that I'm trying to make here. All right, so as a conclusion, once again, the 5 tips, and I hope that they are useful to you and that you maybe can use them when you go back to your organization and speed up your own architecture feedback. I'll go back to this slide. Any questions? Yes.
Can you separate the big monolithic document into those 3 types? How do you correlate anything in one of those 3 types to another?
So the question is, when you separate your monolithic architecture document into 3 types of knowledge, how do you connect them with each other? Of course, you can use links if they're all in, if they're in wikis, you can use links to do that. That's probably the most obvious one. But that's a good point. There should also always be traceability and connectability between them. If there's a decision that you're making that is about a particular requirement that's documented somewhere else, then you should find some way to identify that requirement. If the decision is about a particular component, find some unique way to identify that component that may be in some other repository to make that clear. Does it answer your question? Yeah. Yes?
Is there a fundamental difference between an architecture document and an architecture decision in the sense that the decision is just a small piece of the document? Or is there something actually fundamentally different about a decision than what you would put in an architecture document?
So you're asking, is there a fundamental difference between architectural decisions and architecture documents, except for that the decisions are what the documents are made out of? Yeah, I think architecture documentation is more than just a sum of decisions. I think there's other stuff going on there. I think most significantly modeling. And modeling is a way of showing or analyzing relationships between things, aspects of your solution that you cannot that just writing down decisions won't clarify. So I think there is definitely something additional to that. The decisions, of course, you write down in a language that makes very clear what the decision is, why you're making it, what its impact is, who it's impacting, etc. But the models are a way of communicating, not just of analyzing, but also of communicating to particular stakeholders. And they should always be in the language of the stakeholders you're communicating to. The same is true in a way of decisions, but I think there's less variation there.
So if your feedback loop is to try to deliver these or iterate on these architectural decisions quickly, at what point do you come back in and bring that overarching model that pulls them together?
I have a spare slide for that. Thank you for that question. This is a question I get a lot. If your architecture is a continuous process of making decisions, And then from time to time you have to create a model or a document for your stakeholders. How do you know when you should do that? And how do you, and basically a more specific question is, how do you correlate the quick decision-making loop with the cadence of your organization, of the governance of your organizations? And then we are talking about things like compliance with project management standards and stuff like that. And here, here you see typical phases of a project, like startup, initiation phase, realization phase, operation phase. And many organizations have some kind of mandatory, milestones here where there are decisions made by management, right? Approval moments. And here we have the practices. These are our CDA practices, risk and cost-driven architecture practices. I won't go into that. But basically they represent the architecture process. And what happens is that you make a few iterations through that at startup, and then you sort of make a snapshot of the current architecture after those decisions have been made, which is just an architecture outline, and it just contains enough information for your stakeholders that need to approve there. And then the same thing happens at the next approval moment. You have, of course, a lot more. This is probably some kind of a design phase. You go through a lot of architecture decision making, a lot of cycles here. But then at a certain point in time, you have to make sure that the stakeholder concerns that are related to this specific milestone are addressed by a set of architecture views. And that is where you make the next snapshot of your architectural decisions. That way, you know when to make these snapshots, but also you give your business stakeholders baselines, because many business stakeholders get uneasy when architecture seems to be this fluid thing that keeps going, and they get the feeling that they have lost control over the whole architectural process. By having these snapshots, you are giving them baselines and saying, okay, this project initiation document is tied to this version of the architecture, which we have. It's not in concrete. It can still be changed, but at least we know how this relates to that set of architectural decisions.
The great circle, do you stick it in that phase?
No, that just means that you're lightly touching it. You're lightly touching it. You're having for example, solution costing here. You start with a very high level estimate, but here is a sketch, right? And then you are. Yeah. You're the first one ever to ask me this question. I've shown these slides for years. Okay. One last question? I think we're running out of questions just when we're running out of time, so that's excellent. Thank you.